The atmosphere was alive with tension, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon on a chilly autumn morning, the temperature hovering at a brisk 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint hint of smoke from the distant chimneys of a nearby village. The smell of freshly cut grass wafted through the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of ripe fruit from the orchards that dotted the landscape. A faint mist hung low to the ground, casting an ethereal gloom over the rolling hills and verdant forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the midst of this serene landscape, a sense of unease settled over the soldiers as they emerged from their makeshift camp, their boots squelching in the damp soil. The sound of clanking metal and muttered conversations filled the air as they began to stir, their movements slow and deliberate. Each man was armed with a rifle, the specific model being the M1 Garand, a sturdy and reliable weapon that had proven itself time and again in the heat of battle. The guns were a deep, matte black, with a subtle sheen that hinted at the meticulous care with which they were maintained. As the soldiers moved to take up their positions, the sound of rustling fabric and creaking leather filled the air, accompanied by the occasional clink of metal on metal. The men were dressed in standard-issue uniforms, the fabric a thick, sturdy cotton that was both durable and practical. The uniforms were a deep olive green, with subtle variations in shade and texture that spoke to the individuality of each man. Some wore their uniforms with a precision that bordered on obsession, every crease and fold meticulously in place, while others wore theirs with a more relaxed air, the fabric rumpled and worn from countless hours of wear. The soldiers' faces were set with determination, their eyes narrowed against the rising sun. Some wore helmets, the curved metal a deep, burnished steel that glinted in the growing light. Others wore caps, the fabric a sturdy cotton that was both practical and comfortable. Each man moved with a sense of purpose, their actions guided by a deep-seated understanding of their role in the larger scheme of things. They were a well-oiled machine, each component working in harmony with the others to achieve a common goal. As the soldiers took up their positions, the sound of murmured conversations gave way to an expectant silence. The air was thick with anticipation, the sense of waiting that hung over the men like a palpable mist. They knew that they were on the cusp of something momentous, something that would change the course of their lives forever. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional sound of a rifle being checked, or the soft rustle of fabric as a man shifted his weight. To the north, the trees loomed like sentinels, their branches etched against the sky like a delicate pen and ink drawing. The leaves were a vibrant green, with hints of gold and crimson that spoke to the approaching autumn. A faint breeze stirred the leaves, causing them to rustle and whisper to one another in a soft, raspy voice. The sound was soothing, a gentle counterpoint to the tension that hung over the soldiers like a sword of Damocles. The sun continued its slow ascent, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. The mist that had hung low to the ground began to burn off, revealing the rolling hills and verdant forests in all their glory. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, and the distant call of a bird could be heard, its melodic voice rising and falling in a gentle cadence. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, a poignant reminder of the beauty that existed in a world torn apart by conflict and violence. As the soldiers stood waiting, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional sound of a rifle being checked, or the soft rustle of fabric as a man shifted his weight. Men were coiled springs, ready to unleash their pent-up energy at a moment's notice. They knew that they were on the cusp of something momentous, something that would change the course of their lives forever. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, each one stretching out like an eternity. The soldiers stood frozen, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The air was thick with anticipation, the sense of waiting that hung over the men like a palpable mist. And then, without warning, the silence was shattered by the sound of gunfire, the sharp crack of a rifle echoing through the stillness like a thunderclap. The soldiers' heads snapped towards the sound, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The moment of truth had arrived, and the men were ready. As the battle commenced, the left flank of the Allied forces, comprised of the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions, began to advance in a staggered formation, with the 1st Division leading the way. The troops moved in a series of short, deliberate bounds, utilizing the available cover and concealment to minimize their exposure to the enemy's firepower. A second division, meanwhile, provided supporting fire from a distance, laying down a withering field of suppressive fire that forced the enemy to keep their heads down and limited their ability to return effective fire. On the right flank, the 3rd and 4th Infantry Divisions adopted a more fluid, adaptive approach, utilizing the terrain to their advantage as they sought to outmaneuver the enemy. The 3rd Division, spearheaded by a company of elite riflemen, pushed forward in a series of swift, agile bounds, seeking to exploit any weaknesses in the enemy's lines. As they advanced, the 4th Division provided a firm base of fire, anchoring the flank and preventing the enemy from launching a counterattack. At the center of the Allied lines, the Armored Division, comprising a mix of heavy tanks and lighter, more agile reconnaissance vehicles, prepared to deliver the decisive blow. The tanks, arrayed in a broad, sweeping arc, began to advance in a slow, deliberate pace, their guns blazing as they sought to blast a hole through the enemy's defenses. The reconnaissance vehicles, meanwhile, darted forward in a series of rapid, probing thrusts, seeking to identify and exploit any weaknesses in the enemy's lines. As the Allied forces advanced, their artillery provided a steady, pounding beat of supporting fire, raining down a relentless barrage of shells upon the enemy's positions. The guns, carefully ranged and calibrated to maximize their effectiveness, delivered a withering field of fire that shattered the enemy's morale and disrupted their command and control structures. The artillery fire was carefully coordinated with the infantry's advance, with the guns lifting and shifting their fire to accommodate the troops' movement, seeking to create a seamless, integrated pattern of fire and maneuver. On the enemy's side, the defensive lines were arrayed in a series of deep, layered belts, with the most forward positions occupied by lightly armed skirmishers and snipers. These troops, highly skilled and motivated, sought to harass and delay the Allied advance, using their knowledge of the terrain to maximum effect as they launched a series of sharp, probing attacks against the Allied flanks. Behind the skirmishers, the main bow ready of the enemy's infantry was arrayed in a series of formidable, heavily fortified positions, with deep trenches, barbed wire, and extensive networks of mines and booby traps. As the battle raged on, the enemy's artillery, comprising a mix of heavy guns and lighter, more mobile howitzers, began to make its presence felt. The guns, carefully sighted and calibrated to maximize their effectiveness, delivered a withering field of fire that sought to disrupt the Allied advance and shatter their morale. The artillery fire was particularly effective against the Allied tanks, which were forced to navigate a series of narrow, winding paths through the enemy's minefields and trenches. Despite the formidable nature of the enemy's defenses, the Allied forces continued to push forward, driven by a fierce determination to achieve their objectives. The infantry, supported by the armor and artillery, began to make steady gains, slowly but surely grinding down the enemy's resistance. On the left flank, the 1st and 2nd Divisions managed to break through the enemy's outer defenses, pushing forward into the depths of the enemy's positions. The 3rd and 4th Divisions, meanwhile, continued to outmaneuver the enemy, utilizing their speed and agility to outflank and encircle the enemy's strongpoints. As the battle reached its climax, the Allied forces launched a series of bold, decisive thrusts against the enemy's central positions. The armor, backed by the infantry and artillery, delivered a crushing blow that shattered the enemy's defenses and sent their troops reeling. The enemy's lines, already weakened by the relentless pounding of the Allied artillery, began to collapse as the troops lost heart and began to flee in disarray. The Allied forces, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed forward with renewed energy and determination, seeking to exploit the enemy's weakness and achieve a complete and decisive triumph. In the midst of this chaotic, swirling melee, individual acts of heroism and bravery stood out, as soldiers on both sides fought with fierce determination to achieve their objectives. A young lieutenant, leading a platoon of infantry, rallied his troops and led a daring charge against the enemy's strongpoints, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. A sergeant, commanding a tank, navigated the treacherous terrain with skill and precision, delivering a series of devastating blows against the enemy's positions. A private, armed with nothing more than a rifle and a bayonet, single-handedly cleared a series of enemy trenches, fighting with a fierce, unyielding ferocity that inspired his comrades and struck fear into the hearts of the enemy. As the battle drew to a close, the Allied forces emerged victorious, having achieved their objectives and shattered the enemy's defenses. The enemy, meanwhile, lay broken and defeated, their troops scattered and disorganized. The battlefield, once a scene of fierce and intense combat, was now a tranquil, eerie and cascape, littered with the debris of war and the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite, and the only sound was the distant rumble of artillery, fading slowly into the distance. The Allied forces, weary and exhausted, began to regroup and reorganize, preparing to push forward once more and achieve the ultimate victory. As the battle raged on, the intricacies of modern warfare became increasingly apparent. The M1 Abrams tanks, with their 120mm smoothbore cannons, were wreaking havoc on the enemy's defenses. The armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot, APF-SDS, rounds were capable of penetrating even the most robust fortifications, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The tanks' advanced fire control systems, which utilized laser rangefinders and thermal imaging, allowed them to engage targets with pinpoint accuracy, even in the most chaotic of environments. Meanwhile, the AH-64 Apache helicopters were providing close air support, their 30mm M230 chain guns laying down a withering field of fire that cut through enemy infantry like a scythe through wheat. The helicopters' Advanced Target Sight Systems, TSS, allowed them to identify and engage targets with ease, their millimeter-wave radars, and low-light television systems, enabling them to operate effectively even in the most adverse weather conditions. As the ground forces pushed forward, they were supported by a barrage of artillery fire, the 155mm M109A6, Paladin howitzers, and 227mm M270 multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, unleashing a maelstrom of high-explosive shells and rockets that shattered the enemy's command and control structures. The precision-guided munitions, which utilized GPS and inertial navigation systems to guide them to their targets, were particularly effective, allowing the artillery to engage enemy positions with unprecedented accuracy. The chaos of battle was palpable, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite, the sound of gunfire and explosions creating a deafening cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The soldiers were stretched to their limits, their training and discipline being tested to the utmost as they struggled to maintain a coherent and effective battle plan in the face of such intense and unpredictable combat. Despite the challenges, the troops persevered, their resolve strengthened by the knowledge that they were fighting for a just cause. The enemy, on the other hand, was beginning to show signs of weakness, their lines wavering as the relentless pressure of the Allied assault began to take its toll. The enemy's command and control structures were being systematically dismantled, their ability to coordinate an effective response to the Allied attack rapidly diminishing. As the battle raged on, the logistical challenges of supplying the troops with ammunition, fuel, and other essential supplies became increasingly pronounced. The Allied forces had established a complex network of supply lines, which stretched back to their bases and depots. And it was a Herculean task to keep these lines open and functioning. The logistical teams worked tirelessly, often under enemy fire, to ensure that the troops had the supplies they needed to continue the fight. The medical evacuation teams were also working around the clock, evacuating the wounded to medical facilities where they could receive the care they needed. The medical teams were a testament to the bravery and selflessness of the human spirit, their dedication to their work unwavering even in the face of such extreme danger. They worked with precision and skill, stabilizing the wounded and preparing them for transport to medical facilities, often making the difference between life and death. As the day wore on, the battle showed no signs of abating, the intensity of the combat only increasing as the enemy became more and more desperate. The Allied forces were making steady gains, but the enemy was not going to give up without a fight. The soldiers were exhausted, their bodies drained of energy, but they knew they had to keep pushing forward. They were fighting for their lives, and for the lives of their comrades, and they would not rest until the enemy had been defeated. The officers were working tirelessly to coordinate the battle, their radios and communications equipment, allowing them to stay in touch with their troops and adjust their tactics on the fly. They were making decisions in real time, based on the latest intelligence and battlefield reports, and their ability to adapt to changing circumstances was crucial to the success of the operations. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, the soldiers prepared for another long and bloody night. They knew that the enemy would not give up easily, and that the fighting would continue until one side or the other had emerged victorious. They steeled themselves for the challenges ahead, their hearts filled with a sense of duty and purpose, and their minds focused on the task at hand. They were warriors, and this was their moment. They would not falter, and they would not fail. The night ahead would be filled with uncertainty and danger, but the soldiers were ready, They had trained for this, and they had prepared themselves for the worst. They knew that the enemy would try to exploit any weaknesses they could find, and that they would have to be vigilant and proactive if they were to emerge victorious. But they were not afraid, for they knew that they had the training, the equipment, and the determination to succeed. They were a team, a cohesive unit of warriors who were united in their quest for victory, and they would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. As the darkness deepened, the battlefield became even more chaotic, the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing through the night air. The soldiers were on high alert, their senses heightened as they scanned the darkness for any sign of enemy activity. They knew that the enemy would try to launch a counterattack, to exploit any weaknesses they could find in the Allied lines, and they were determined to be ready. They were the defenders, the guardians of the Allied position, and they would not let the enemy pass. The night was a time of shadows and stealth, a time when the enemy might try to launch a sneak attack to catch the Allies off guard. But the soldiers were vigilant, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. They knew that the enemy was out there, waiting for an opportunity to strike, and they were determined to deny them that opportunity. They were the masters of the night, the warriors who owned the shadows, and they would not be intimidated. As the hours ticked by, the battle raged on, the intensity of the combat ebbing and flowing like a tide. The soldiers were exhausted, their bodies drained of energy, but they refused to give up. They knew that the enemy was weakening, that their lines were beginning to break, and they were determined to press their advantage. They were the victors, the conquerors of the battlefield, and they would not rest until they had emerged triumphant. The night was a time of fear and uncertainty, but it was also a time of courage and determination. The soldiers were the heroes of the hour, the warriors who were fighting for their lives and for the lives of their comrades. They were the defenders of the free world, the guardians of freedom and democracy, and they would not falter. They would not fail. They would emerge victorious, their hearts filled with pride and their spirits unbroken. They were the warriors of the night, the masters of the battlefield, and they would triumph over all. As the sun began to set on the battlefield, casting a golden glow over the carnage, the intensity of the fighting only seemed to escalate. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and blood, and the sound of gunfire, screams, and explosions created a deafening cacophony that threatened to consume all in its path. The ground beneath the feet of the soldiers was slick with mud and blood, making every step a treacherous one, and the cries of the wounded and dying hung in the air like a mournful dirge. To the north, the enemy's artillery was pounding away with relentless ferocity, sending shell after shell crashing down onto the beleaguered troops. The earth shook beneath the impact of each explosion, sending soldiers tumbling to the ground, and the blast waves from the detonations ripped through the ranks, tearing men apart with ease. The artillery's thunderous roar was like a living thing, a beast that breathed fire and destruction, and it seemed to be closing in on the defenders from all sides. Meanwhile, the enemy's infantry was making a push to outflank the defenders, attempting to find a weak point in the line that they could exploit. They advanced in waves, their rifles at the ready and their bayonets glinting in the fading light. The defenders, however, were not about to give up without a fight. They huddled behind their barricades, pouring fire into the oncoming ranks, and cutting down anyone who dared to get too close. The enemy's cries of, "For the motherland!" were met with defiant shouts of, "We will never surrender!" as the two sides clashed in a frenzy of bloodlust and patriotism. As the battle raged on, the casualties began to mount. Men fell on both sides, their bodies broken and battered, their lives slipping away with each passing moment. The medical teams did their best to tend to the wounded, but it was a losing battle. The sheer number of casualties was overwhelming, and the stretcher bearers were stretched to the limit as they struggled to keep up with the demand. The cries of the wounded filled the air, a constant reminder of the horrors that were being perpetrated on the battlefield. Despite the chaos and the carnage, there were moments of heroism and sacrifice that stood out amidst the mayhem. A young lieutenant, barely out of his teens, rallied his platoon and led them in a daring charge against the enemy's positions. They fought their way through the enemy's lines, taking out gun emplacements and infantry strongpoints, and buying precious time for their comrades to regroup and counterattack. The lieutenant was cut down in the final moments of the charge, but his bravery and selflessness inspired his men to fight on, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the night began to fall, the battle showed no signs of letting up. The enemy's artillery continued to pound away, and their infantry kept coming, wave after wave of them. The defenders were exhausted, their ammunition was running low, and their numbers were dwindling. But they refused to give up. They knew that if they could just hold out until dawn, reinforcements would arrive, and the tide of the battle would turn in their favor. So they dug deep, finding reserves of strength and courage that they never knew they had, and they prepared to face whatever the night might bring. The hours ticked by at a glacial pace, each one stretching out into an eternity of fear and uncertainty. The enemy's attacks were relentless, pushing the defenders to the limit of their endurance. But the defenders would not break. They held their ground, fighting with every ounce of strength they had, and waiting for the dawn to come. And when it finally did, the battlefield was bathed in a pale, golden light, and the defenders knew that they had made it through the night. They had survived the worst of the battle, and they were ready to face whatever the new day might bring. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the enemy's attacks began to falter. Their artillery fire slowed to a trickle, and their infantry assaults lost their momentum. The defenders, sensing victory within their grasp, began to push back, counterattacking with a ferocity that caught the enemy off guard. The battle was far from over, but the tide had finally turned. The defenders were on the move, and they would not be stopped. The enemy's lines were beginning to break, and their soldiers were starting to flee in panic. The defenders pursued them, cutting them down without mercy, and driving them back with a fierce and unrelenting onslaught. The battlefield was a scene of utter devastation, a landscape of death and destruction that seemed to stretch on forever. The ground was littered with the bodies of the dead and the dying, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood. But amidst the carnage, there was a sense of hope, a sense that the worst of the battle was finally over, and that victory was within sight. The defenders had endured the unimaginable, and they had emerged triumphant. They had held their ground against all odds, and they had fought their way to the brink of victory. All that remained now was to deliver the final blow, to crush the enemy once and for all, and to emerge victorious from the wreckage of the battlefield. The once pristine streets were now a canvas of unimaginable destruction, with buildings reduced to rubble and debris scattered as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the stench of death. As the survivors stumbled through the ruins, shell-shocked and desperate for any sign of hope, the sounds of gunfire and explosions had finally subsided, replaced by an eerie silence, punctuated only by the moans of the wounded, the cries of those who had lost everything. As the dust began to settle, the true extent of the devastation became clear. Entire city blocks had been reduced to nothing more than smoldering ruins, with crumbling facades and twisted metal wreckage, a grim testament to the ferocity of the battle. The streets were choked with the detritus of war, as broken glass, shattered concrete, and twisted metal stretched out in every direction, a seemingly endless landscape of destruction and despair. The casualty reports began to filter in, and the numbers were staggering. Thousands had been killed or wounded, with many more still trapped beneath the rubble, their fate uncertain. The hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, with medical staff working around the clock to treat the injured, despite being woefully unprepared for the sheer scale of the disaster. The survivors, many of whom had lost loved ones, wandered the streets in a daze, searching for any news of their missing family members, their faces etched with grief and despair. Individual stories of survival began to emerge, each one a testament to the human spirit's capacity for resilience and determination. There was Maria, a young mother who had shielded her 2 children from the worst of the bombing, only to emerge from their makeshift shelter to find their home had been reduced to rubble. Despite the trauma she had endured, Maria managed to find a way to get her children to safety, walking for miles through the devastated land Salak, with no food, no water, and no clear destination in mind. Then there was John, a soldier who had been separated from his unit during the fighting, and had found himself alone, wounded, and adrift in a sea of chaos. With no clear way to communicate with his comrades, John had been forced to rely on his wits and his training to survive, scavenging for food and shelter, and avoiding the roving gangs of marauders who preyed on the weak and the vulnerable. Despite being shot and left for dead, John had managed to crawl to safety, where he was eventually found by a group of aid workers who nursed him back to health and helped him to reconnect with his unit. As the days turned into weeks, the city began to slowly come back to life. The survivors, though traumatized, began to rebuild, using whatever materials they could find to construct makeshift shelters and start the long, slow process of healing. The aid workers, who had poured into the city from all over the world, worked tirelessly to provide food, water, and medical care to those in need, often at great personal risk to themselves, and the soldiers who had fought so bravely to defend the city began to regroup and plan their next move, determined to drive the enemy back and reclaim the territory they had lost. But even as the city began to stir, the true extent of the damage was only just beginning to become clear. The bombing had not only destroyed buildings and infrastructure, but had also shattered the very fabric of society. The social bonds that had held the community together had been stretched to the breaking point, and, in many cases, had snapped. The rule of law had broken down, and with it, the sense of security and stability that had once been taken for granted. The city was now a dystopian nightmare, a place where the strong preyed on the weak, and the desperate and the vulnerable were forced to fend for themselves. The streets were a battleground, where gangs and militias and even rogue soldiers fought for control, and the rule of law was a distant memory. And yet, even in the midst of such chaos and destruction, there were glimmers of hope. The human spirit, which had been tested to the limit, was beginning to reassert itself, as people from all walks of life came together to support each other and to rebuild. In the face of unimaginable disaster, the survivors had found a way to persevere, to adapt, and to overcome. They had formed communities and support networks, and had begun to rebuild, using whatever resources they could find. They had created makeshift schools and hospitals, and had even established their own systems of government, as they struggled to create a sense of order and stability in a world that had been turned upside down. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, the survivors were determined to rebuild, to create a new future, one that would be brighter and more hopeful than the one they had lost. They would rebuild their homes, their schools, and their hospitals. And they would create a new society, one that would be more just and more equal than the one that had been destroyed. The city would rise from the ashes, like a phoenix, and it would be reborn, stronger and more resilient than ever before. But for now, the city was a place of darkness and despair, a place where the survivors were forced to confront the worst aspects of human nature and to struggle every day to stay alive. The streets were a war zone, where the rule of law had broken down and where the strongest survived, while the weak perished. The people were traumatized and exhausted, and they were forced to live in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next bomb would fall or the next bullet would be fired. And yet, even in the midst of such chaos and destruction, there were moments of beauty and of hope: a child's laughter, a mother's smile, a lover's kiss. These were the things that reminded the survivors that even in the darkest of times, there was still a spark of humanity, a spark that could ignite and burn brightly and guide them through the darkness. The city might be broken, but the human spirit was not, and it was this that would ultimately lead the survivors out of the ruins and into a brighter, more hopeful future. The aftermath of the conflict had a profound and lasting impact on the global landscape, with far-reaching consequences that continue to shape international relations to his day. The war had created a power vacuum, allowing new nations to emerge and existing ones to reassert their dominance. The delicate balance of power had been disrupted, and the world was forever changed. In the years that followed, the global community struggled to come to terms with the devastation and loss of life caused by the war. The international community came together to establish new frameworks for cooperation and diplomacy, aimed at preventing such a catastrophic conflict from occurring again. The creation of the United Nations and other international organizations marked a significant shift towards a more collaborative and peaceful approach to global governance. However, the legacy of the war also extends beyond the realm of international relations. The conflict had a profound impact on the social and cultural fabric of the nations involved. The war had brought about unprecedented levels of mobilization and sacrifice, with millions of people contributing to the war effort in various ways. The experience of total war had a profound impact on the collective psyche of the nations involved, shaping their values, attitudes, and beliefs for generations to come. The war also had a profound impact on the global economy, with the United States emerging as a dominant economic power. The war had stimulated American industry, and the country had become a major producer of military equipment and supplies. The post-war period saw a significant expansion of American economic influence, with the United States playing a key role in shaping the global economic order. In the decades that followed, the world witnessed a period of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity, often referred to as the post-war boom. The war had created a sense of shared purpose and cooperation, and the international community came together to rebuild and restore the devastated regions. The establishment of the Bretton Woods system and the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank marked a significant shift towards a more integrated and interconnected global economy. However, the legacy of the war is not without its challenges and controversies. The conflict had created new tensions and rivalries, particularly between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War, which lasted for decades, was a direct consequence of the war, with the two superpowers engaging in a bitter ideological and strategic struggle. The war had also created new fault lines and divisions, particularly in the Middle East and Asia, where the legacy of colonialism and imperialism continued to shape the regional landscape. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the need to come to terms with the legacy of the war. The international community has made significant progress in promoting reconciliation and forgiveness, with many nations acknowledging their role in the conflict and taking steps to make amends. The creation of museums, memorials, and other commemorative sites has helped to preserve the history and memory of the war, serving as a reminder of the devastating consequences of conflict and the importance of promoting peace and understanding. As we reflect on the legacy of the war, it is clear that the conflict had a profound and lasting impact on the world. The war had brought about significant changes in the global landscape, shaping the course of international relations, global governance, and the world economy. However, the legacy of the war is not just about the past. It is also about the present and the future. The war serves as a reminder of the importance of promoting peace, understanding, and cooperation, and the need for nations to work together to address the complex and pressing challenges of the 21st century. In the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." This profound statement reminds us that the world is constantly changing, and that our understanding of the past is always evolving. As we look to the future, it is essential that we draw on the lessons of history, while also embracing the complexities and uncertainties of the present. As we conclude our journey through the history of the war, we hope that you have gained a deeper understanding of the conflict and its lasting impact on the world. We invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we will continue to explore the complexities and nuances of military history and examine the ways in which the past continues to shape our present and future. By subscribing, you will gain access to a wealth of knowledge and insights, and become part of a community of individuals who are passionate about understanding the world and its many complexities. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to exploring the fascinating world of military history with you in the future.